Good morning. It's Sunday, January 28th. We are so excited to welcome our own Ben Zeller. And when you say our own, that means he's a congregant. That's our lingo. And I just want to tell you a little bit about him. He is a professor at the chair of religion and chair of Islamic world studies at Lake Forest College. His areas specialization are religion in America, religion and culture, religion and science, and new religious movements. We have been very lucky at Macomb Soleil Lakeside to, he's spoke before on some of his specialties, and we can't wait to hear about religions in museums, a new class that he just did with his students. Ben.
Thank you, Vanessa, for the lovely introduction. Yeah, so this is, I'm talking today about one of the things that is one of the perks of being a tenured professor in higher academia, which is that you sort of get to teach what you want to. So this was a brand new class that I taught last semester on exhibiting religion in the museum. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I ended up teaching the class, what my students and I studied. And then mostly today, I'm interested in what you all think about it, because sort of the key to the topic is that I'm no expert, actually, and that I have no training in museum studies. And although I've now read pretty much all the scholarship that's out there on religion and museums, it's because there's very limited scholarship on religion and museums. There's about 3 books and maybe about that many articles as well. But what got me into it was I love museums and I love going to museums. And whenever I go into museums, because I'm trained in the study of religion, I'm often thinking in the back of my head, even sort of subconsciously, where's the religion? So when I go to the Art Institute, for example, if you walk in what I think of as the main entrance, with the lions in front, as you walk back, you walk through a gallery of Hindu art. There's some Buddhist art there as well, so Asian art. And I often think about the way that is exhibited and the choices that were made in putting Hindu and Buddhist religious art in the center in that way, but also how it's interpreted, how it's explained, what is emphasized in it, and the way in which, what museum studies people call interpretation is what you and I might call the labels or the placards or the writing up on the wall that tells you the name of the gallery, everything that tells you how you should understand the piece. So I think about how different religions are presented in different ways. So is the way Hinduism is presented through a Hindu icon the same way in which Christianity is presented through an altarpiece elsewhere in the museum, or Judaism, or defunct religions like ancient Greek religion? So when you go sort of in the back area, if people have been there, I'm talking about, you sort of keep walking back, and if you fork left or fork right, you go past some Greek or Roman art. Are the religions of the ancient Greek or Roman people, those religions are now basically defunct, presented in what way? Sorry. That led me then to think about what religions are present in some museums and not in others. So, for example, when you go to the Field Museum, I use Chicago examples here, but you can do this with anything. If you go to the Field Museum, which religions are presented there? So ancient Egyptian religion. So those who've been to the Field Museum know there's that big sort of temple. The religions of indigenous peoples. So if you go into the different areas, you see Polynesian religion, you see Native American religion, there's a few other sort of examples scattershot, but how come those religions are presented in the Field Museum of Natural History and other religions are presented in the Chicago Art Institute of Chicago, and vice versa? Why, for example, is Judaism, which is as ancient a religion as the ones which you find in the Field Museum, generally speaking, not in the field, but in the Art Institute, or artists exhibited in its own way? So those are the questions that drove me. And it drove me to pick up a couple of books on religion and museum and read them. And then it drove me to talk to my students and say, hey, we're gonna have a class and we're gonna study this together. And I'm gonna send my students out to as many museums as we can find in Chicagoland. And we're gonna report back to each other about what religions are present and how they've been collected and how they've been exhibited and how they've been interpreted. And we can think about patterns. The other sort of impetus for this, and then we'll get into sort of the what we're going to do today. Other sort of impetus from this is an article I read from several years ago from a woman named Sophaline Shapiro, who wrote a little article called "Met Museum Kicked Me Out for Praying to My Ancestral Gods." This became sort of a viral internet sensation. The ancestral gods she was referring to were Cambodian. She went to the Met in New York and attempted to perform a Cambodian ritual dance in front of a Cambodian a statue of a Cambodian god, which included taking her shoes off because that's what you do in Cambodian dance.
I was just going to say, did she take her clothes off?
Not her clothes, just her shoes. Took her shoes off because that's what you do there. And then she was sort of blocking everyone else's way and moving around. And the security guard said, "Yeah, this is not the place for that." And now I should note she had brought like 3 people with her with cameras and everything. So this was a stunt. This was a viral stunt. But it was an interesting one, and I read it and it was a provocative one. I'm also fascinated that her last name is Shapiro, so there's something going on there. But um, it, it it would not be the only, she would not be the only person. So I imagined then when I read that, I imagined I have a Hindu friend who brings his Hindu relatives when they come from India to the Art Institute to look at this amazing collection of Hindu sacred art we have. Now they're very sort of elite, sort of well-educated people. They know the rules, what you do in a museum. But I imagine, would it be possible that a person who'd never been to a museum, you walk in, you see an image which belongs in a temple, and you do what you do in a temple. You bow down, or you do a chant, or could have. Again, I'm trying to imagine if there's a Torah scroll on display in a museum, would someone try to go to go aliyah to this and try to read it? And again, if you've been to a museum, you're not supposed to. But what if you don't know? And in fact, who gets to make those rules? And there was another case of in Los Angeles where it was I believe it was a voodoo or a Santeria practitioner who saw an object from their religion and sort of engaged in the proper prayer functions you do. And there was I don't think they were kicked out, but there was sort of a big deal about it. So that made me thinking. And the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll talk about what we're going to do for the rest of the day or our time together, is I remembered a visit I had to Florence many years ago. I was there checking out a study abroad program our college was interested in, and it was a lovely place. So I was visiting some of the sacred sites. So I was in a church, and I forget which one. There's many beautiful churches in Florence, and there was a nun who was walking sort of right in front of me, and I was going to ask a question about something I didn't, but she was walking right in front of me. And I figured she was working there. And then I realized as she and I were walking around, this nun was a tourist because she kept taking pictures of everything. And of course, I mean, nuns go on vacations too, but I thought about themselves as museums. And this nun was there and she was taking, she didn't speak any Italian. She was actually Spanish speaking. And then she was getting pictures of all of these. And, this was it was a pilgrimage, but it was also a museum. She was interested in the art, obviously. So, so that blurry line between museums, cultural sites, sacred sites, then and what is a museum? So with all that to be said, here's what I thought we would do today. I thought I'd give you some background on religion and the museum, with the historical connection between them. Talk about some case studies of actual museums which deal with religion. Tell you what my students did. And then I thought we'd break up into discussion because you all, I'm guessing, have been to lots of museums, and I have some questions for you all to talk about. And then you can talk in small groups about it. Then we'll come back and we can share sort of our collective observations. And I have my own thoughts. I have a page full of sort of thoughts of things that my students and I found, but I'd rather hear from you first and we can sort of connect them. But real quickly, I'm going to give you sort of Religion and Museums 101. So again, with the caveat being that I'm not a museum studies scholar. Ironically, my brother actually has a degree in museum studies. So the wrong Zeller is here. If you got
We'll get him next year.
He's a curator of museums. He actually knows what he's doing. But I will say I've read quite a bit in museum studies now, and it's the history of the museum is actually, it's a Greek word, and literally it means the place of the muses. So the museum is the place of the muses, and the muses were the gods and goddesses of the arts. So the original museums were Greek sacred sites dedicated to worship of the muses. But if you and I were to hop back in time somehow and go to the early Greek museums, it would plausibly look like a museum to us. You would see art, You would see, it would look maybe a bit like a theater perhaps as well. You'd see performance, but you would see the exhibition of cultural, religious objects in this case. But it would look and function like a museum to us. There'd be people who go there, visitors. There'd be curators. In this case, they'd actually be priests or priestesses of the muses. But it's an ancient institution which was reinvented in the Renaissance under the guise of sort of humanism as a way to foster and exhibit and encourage and spread human culture and sort of the beauty of human culture. And it drew from sort of two particular antecedents. One was the art gallery. So people have been collecting art, forever, but generally it was individual patrons. So different patrons would have art galleries. But of course, if you didn't know the patron, you were unlikely to be invited into their home to see it. Again, with some exceptions, some people would have times where they would invite, the people could come in and see art on display. But just, there was the art gallery. And the other thing was the curiosity cabinet. The curiosity cabinet were collections that were put together and some of them were highbrow and some were lowbrow. So you can think that the highbrow ones were often from world travelers or from societies which had collected materials, generally sort of curious things from around the world. They were usually specialized. Some people specialized in natural specimens, so pressed flowers from the different continents, or sometimes they were cultural objects. Sometimes missionaries, so Christian missionaries, they would go abroad, they would try to convert the natives, but they would bring back sort of objects. So you would have totems from from different religious groups from around the world, and these would be assembled. And then they would be stored in these what were called the curiosity cabinets, usually in people's homes or sometimes in the mission centers or sometimes universities or libraries. What the museum did is it sort of fused these together, the display of objects and art, but for the purpose of benefiting the visitor who would be edified by seeing either these art or learn from the culture, learn from the objects. And this was sort of a slow process, but it was also deeply integrated in the 18th and 19th century, which is sort of the birth of the modern museum, into the spread of colonialism and nationalism and empire. So the British Museum, which is famous and very controversial now for whether they should give back this stuff, as the British Empire went out and collected stuff, it was sent back to London and put on display. And they were maybe a little nicer in Paris with the Louvre, but it was the same basic idea. You bought it as opposed to pilfered it, generally speaking.
I just heard that they're giving something back to Ghana.
They have some pilfered stuff there too. So it's sort of this nation building, culture building, but these great institutions, and every European capital had one, and then later the U.S. lagged, but we got there eventually too. The idea was sort of as the empire expanded, you would collect stuff and bring it back. And it would be sort of a way of holding up sort of the culture of the place, but also sort of bring the world to your now sort of cultured, edified, educated populace. But certainly also there was a lot of very, very, in some cases, very petty sort of nationalism at work here. Well, they have that museum, we have to have our own. So if you look at the foundation of some of these museums, it's, we have to put our city on the map. Religion's place in here, and this is interesting, never disappeared. And that's because, generally speaking, both the art, which was on display, was religious art and generally Christian art, because it was coming out of Europe. And also because the objects on display, the curiosities, were often religious objects from abroad, from non-Christian religions. But that is the source of the tension, which we still see today, about whose art gets displayed. Because if you have these dual origins of museums, one is this very sort of high art idea. And again, often then it's Christian art. The other is then, here are these weird things which our explorers found and sent back to us. And weird things often equals other people's religions. Now, museums today are much more nuanced, but you can still find that pattern repeating. But religion truly never truly went away. There was a interest eventually in the creation of actual museums dedicated to religion, of which there's about 5 or 6 that are around. I'm just going to briefly tell you about them, and then, of course, I want to hear what you all have to think. But of these actual museums dedicated to religions, one of the ones I find most fascinating because it makes its narrative explicit. every one of these museums has a narrative. It's whether it's implicit or explicit. One of the most explicit ones was the State Museum of the History of Religions in St. Petersburg, which was built during the Soviet times. And what happened was when the Soviet Union would desacralize the churches, so they would go in and you'd take down all the stuff in the church and make it into a community center or something, or synagogues or mosques. They sent all this material off to St. Petersburg, and they made this museum of all of the stuff which they had taken out of these buildings, which they converted from religious buildings to something else. But the narrative was so obvious. It was about how religion was a primitive thing, and then there were primitive religions, which included shamanism and Judaism was there actually as a primitive religion. And then you had the more advanced religions, Buddhism and Christianity and Islam. And then finally it culminated in Marxism and science. So what was interesting is after the fall of the Soviet Union, they just sort of tacked one on at the end, and they said at the end, well, we're going to put the Russian Orthodox Church at the end as well now. So now it culminates in the Russian Orthodox Church, but it's the same narrative, and it's so explicit. I've not been there. I'm going with people who've been there and written about it, but it's other times the narratives are explicit, but ones we could probably maybe relate to a little more. So if you ever get a chance to go up to Quebec, the Musée de Religion de Mont, which is outside of Montreal in a sort of a medium-sized town, about an hour outside of Montreal. So that's the Museum of the Religions of the World. Has, again, a very explicit narrative, but it's one about pluralism. And if you know the Canadian sort of political world, that makes sense. The whole idea of sort of the power of diversity. So it has, it's based not on objects, but on people and stories and lives. So you walk around and you see images of people and sacred objects and little interpretations talking about their lives, but it emphasizes all the different religions that are present in Canada and how they can all sort of get along. They can all be happy Canadians. So again, it's like really explicit. I won't go through the list of all of them, but it's fascinating that these religion museums tend to be very, very clear about the message you should take away. What's interesting to me then is all exhibition, all interpretation always has a narrative. Where is it implicit? What am I implicitly supposed to be taking away? So with that, and again, I have more examples I could give you, but I want to hear what you all have to say. We're going to try something new. We're going to do breakout rooms, and I'm going to give you a prompt. And Vanessa, I'm going to try to paste into the chat the prompt.
Perfect. And that should show up. I'll just talk about breakout rooms. You're going to get a message, and you just say, yes, you'll go to breakout room 1, 2, 3. We have 26 people, so I would do, I don't know, 5 breakout rooms, tops, maybe 4.
Okay. And you're going to see, so I'm going to post the chat here. I boldfaced a couple of things. And that's the things I boldfaced are considered sort of the central functions of museums. So that helps me organize it. But the functions of museums are typically exhibition, but also interpretation. Again, that's like the placards and sort of all that stuff. But also collection, which is invisible to us typically. But it's how an object got there. It tends to become visible when something really bad happened, when it was stolen or it was pilfered or it was fraudulent. But the collection is relevant as well. You may not know the collection when you're talking, and that's fine. But if you happen to know, it's worth talking about too. How did something end up in a museum? If you can see the prompt, we'll just create the rooms now. Vanessa, do you want me to make them or are you going to make them?
You can make them, because then you can pull everybody back.
Awesome. You made me a
co-host. You should be able to do it. I mean,
just 1 minute. Breakout rooms.
yeah. Ben and I have been doing Zoom these many years, but if you don't do something every week,
Okay, so I'm gonna make, I think we have 26 people. I'll make 6 breakout rooms.
great.
And that's 4 to 5 people. Excellent.
You will have to unmute people.
I do see there's one room that ended up with 5, so I'm gonna just move some.
Okay.
No. Okay, every room should have 4 or 5 people. All right, so let's see, it's 10:24. I'll give you 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to talk, then we'll come back and talk as a group. All right, they're all open. Off you go.
I wonder if I can, uh,
I didn't assign us, Vanessa.
okay,
I think we can hop into any of them that we want.
okay.
There's a few people who haven't.
Yeah, I
um,
think one is my mom.
Okay.
She can do, and one is L. Klein, and I, I think that's fine. We're good.
Not in the same room, so it's okay. Every room has at least 3 people.
Okay, good, 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 good.
Yeah, there we go. So we'll see what they
Let's
discuss.
see what they say.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? What sort of interesting religious things have you seen in museums?
Well, so there's two things which I also may bring up with everybody, is that in Israel,
Mm.
there's a museum called Neot Kidumim, and like you can learn how to press oil and um, you know, and then use it in lamps and so on and so forth. Oh, Todd, I don't know where he is. Anyway,
I'm going to pause the recording. Otherwise, everyone's going to listen to us chatting.
thank you. And hopefully they're all coming back.
I have a question. When you had the rooms, were you able to go into all of them or none of them, or how did that work?
The chat rooms we just had?
Where there were the different breakout rooms,
Right.
were you accessing them or
We were
how did
not.
that work?
We were not. We could, but
Oh.
we were not.
Oh, okay.
We did a breakout.
Good.
We
Good.
could have used a couple more people. It was 4 of us.
Yeah.
I think I made one more than we really needed because there were, I think a couple of the 28 people are actually like
Yeah.
1 person, 2 or 3
Yeah.
devices. So that's okay.
Yeah,
I think one of the
Yes.
questions they came up with that's interesting is if you take a religious item, what women talked about going to these cathedrals in Europe, and you see it in its entirety, then you see it in a museum. Does it change the value? Does it change everything?
Yeah. So let's chat. We'll talk about that's a great one to start with. The technical term for what you're describing is museumification. Does the museumification of an object change it? So when you take you said a Christian church as an example. If you take an altarpiece out of a church and put it in the Met or the Louvre or the Art Institute, does it change it? As opposed to going to see it in situ, on where it is. So if you go to many of the cathedrals of Europe, you can see the art where it was meant to be installed. What happens to the object? What happens to the experience? What happens to the interpretation when it's removed from where it was supposed to be? So I'm putting you scare quotes because who gets to decide, right? The artist, the person who paid for it, where it was originally, we'll say, or maybe not even originally, where it was at one point. So I don't know. Do you have who was it who brought that up? I'm sorry, I didn't have the gallery on, so I couldn't see.
It's Hubie.
Did you have a response or a thought?
We don't know.
Oh, good. Does anyone else? I mean, that's a
Good
great
answer.
That's a great place to start.
Ellie, I'm gonna unmute you. Yes?
excuse me, 1 minute. Can we also talk about why the Jewish Museum downtown, I guess it's no longer a museum?
Curtis?
Curtis, yes.
We can, but I don't know the details.
I can tell you a little bit about it, but
Okay, thanks.
Ellie, did you have a question?
Right. No, it wasn't a question. I was commenting on seeing the objects in the museum itself, or in the church itself, and the total experience that one has in seeing all of it around you, I think is different than seeing a single object for me.
How about the restoration of Notre Dame? Is that going to feel the same when it's done?
Oh, that's a good one.
It's huge.
So here's a couple of ideas which come out of just those 2 comments. One is sort of the question of the function of looking at the art. So for example, if the function is educational, if I want to take my class to go look and we want to study Christian altarpieces. I can't go. I wish I had the funding. We're going to hop over to Europe and go to, 6 different places. I can't even get a bus to get me to 6 churches, right, in Chicago. I can go to one place and I can look at these 6, which were moved from somewhere and put there, and we can spend an hour in one room looking back and forth. Now, that's educational. That's not personal edification. So I don't know. It depends what is the function of the museum. If the function of the museum is to educate, then maybe it does make sense to just put them there, as opposed to, I certainly agree, in terms of personal edification, the aesthetics of it. An altarpiece, or we're using Christian examples, whatever, a Hindu image in a museum is sterile in a way in which it is not if you go to a temple or a synagogue or a mosque or a cathedral or a fill in the blank, right?
Besides education, isn't the purpose also to preserve?
That is one of the functions. Yeah, so that was one of the ones I didn't put in there in boldface. The classic functions of museum: preservation and
Education.
education. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Research.
Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, my feeling has to do with your first question, which was, is it functioning as the same as being in a church? And it is not. What you have is a saturation. You have a different function. You're not there to go through a ceremony or a ritual of any kind. And so therefore, it is separate. When Len and I were in Florence, we went into one of the museums there, and there were a number of saints' bones in the Christian faith. But did we get the feeling that we were in a revered space? No, it was a museum. It was, it was functioning as a museum. And so my feeling is that it's definitely separate. It's not well, a place for ritual ceremony and religious, faith.
I see, I think a lot of hands, Richard and Phyllis, and then I don't know who was next. I think Richard, you were
And
first.
then Hubie. Okay. Right. Rick, go ahead. And then
Okay.
Phyllis.
So building on to what Mary just said, which I agree with her, provides a different experience. But what a museum is able to do is it's able to elevate certain objects or paintings, and it provides focus. So if you go into a church and look around, you're not as, although you might get an overall general feeling, an understanding of how that object or painting was meant to be is what Ben just called in situ. In a museum setting, it allows you to elevate, to focus, and to gather explanations as to what it is you're looking at and why it might have been important. And it can take common everyday items and make them an important part of an ongoing history or culture.
An excellent point. And that's the interpretation,
Yes,
right?
it's very good.
Phyllis.
Doesn't it also depend on the viewer? In other words, if I come to a Christian church in Europe or in St. Louis, I look at the mosaics, I look at the statues, and somebody who's on the kneelers is looking at it as a religious experience. Well, wouldn't that be the essential thing? Mm-hmm.
I think Hubie and then Ellis.
Okay, 3 things. If you wanted to take your students to a class in Techney, Illinois, here, which we live right by, I've been in there. This is a monastery. Go in there and see their church. It's just I was stationed in Europe, and this rally it competes very effectively against some of the churches in Europe, and it's very quiet. And you just got to go there, and you will really see it. Now, the other issue is that you have a function problem. The purpose of a museum is to preserve things. I mean, there are people who, for example, they're dealing with, I know, the studies of birds and stuff. They go to the museums and they look at changes that have occurred in wildlife. And so that comes to the saying, if those who don't read history repeat history. And if you, for example, the museums that return these artwork for burial, if the burial site is not protected, those things are going to be lost forever. So it's a trade-off there.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. A function of the museum is preservation. It isn't the only one, because it's often in tension with other ones, such as education or exhibition.
Yeah,
or research.
I mean, the field museum studies
Yeah.
will go back and find things. They may find a particular bacteria that existed on an animal that was preserved many centuries ago, or on a body, on a mummy, to see that we still have that, or where that disease came from.
I believe Alice is next, and then Mary.
Okay, a museum exhibit also is selective, so it's representative. It's not the whole picture.
Curated, carefully curated. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mary?
Some of the comments that were made, there's a difference between going into a church, which is not a museum, as opposed to going into a museum. Those are two separate, situations. You can look at a church as a historical artifact, but its function is not necessarily as a museum. If that makes sense.
There was a wonderful article published in, I think it was the New York Times, about just this tension for the European cathedrals in particular. And it was using, I forget what was the main example. It wasn't Notre Dame because it already had burnt. But the tension between the increasingly small number of people who go there for religious purposes versus the increasingly large number of people, this is secularized Europe, who are going there as a museum, and the tension at play in these sites. I think it was the New York Times. If I find the article, I will send it to Vanessa. She can share it with you.
I mean, also even the big synagogues in New York, Emmanuel, they closed down because otherwise they'd have tourists coming in and out at all hours of the day. And I didn't think about that tension, but it's definitely a tension. Abby and then Alice.
And
You're
for
muted.
you as an can I?
You're fine. You're
I have
fine.
a question
good.
for-
You're good.
Yeah. My question for you is, as an educator, when you give an assignment, if you do, I'm assuming you probably do, to your students to go into a museum, do you give them with any particular intention in terms of what they are looking for? Because I think that, when you go in with an intention, it's different than just kind of going into something with kind of a blank staring, what is this piece about? Which I think many of us do. We're not sure not sure what we're looking at sometimes. But I'm wondering, what suggestions do you or assignment do you perhaps give them?
Depends on the class. For the museums class, actually, I gave them a long list and they got to choose what they wanted to look at. For a course where we're looking at a particular tradition, then if we're studying Judaism or Christianity and we're going to look at art objects, for example, then often it's about interpretation of the object. What can you identify what a Torah scroll is, and can you identify what an altarpiece is, or what a vestment is, and how do they function? Can you interpret the symbolism on it? What does that cross mean? Is it this cross and not that cross? For my museum studies course, I gave them a long list of things to look at, everything from what is the physical patterning? How do you walk? What things do you see first? What is elevated? What is lowered? What colors are used? Where is their interpretation, which is written? Where is it not? What has been commercialized? What can you buy in the gift shop, and what can't you buy in the gift shop? I had a huge list, and they sort of went where they wanted to. I was chatting with Vanessa when you all were in the breakout rooms, and one of the patterns that my students found was those who went to ethnic cultural museums. So the Puerto Rican Museum or the National Mexican Art Museum, there was religion everywhere, but it was never talked about. You can't walk down a hallway in the National Mexican Art Museum and not see the Virgin Mary, but it's never discussed. So the way in which religion is omnipresent but ignored. The Polish American Museum actually is an example too. If you go to the Polish Museum, which is, I guess, it's right off the highway. It's not far from here. It's sort of just down towards the loop. You'd be surprised to learn that all Poles are basically Catholic. My student who went there, I did not go there. My student who went there said there wasn't a single example of a Jewish Polish person anywhere in that museum.
I bet not.
The way in which Catholicism, Polish nationality, Polish culture were, and my student also said, oh, and by the way, according to the museum, the Germans are horrible. So and there's the way in which sort of this Polish nationality, which was Catholic, as opposed to, you know, the bad Germans, the bad Russians. But it was fascinating. So like, I'm sorry, what do I ask my students? That was something I asked my students, and my students came back and reported. The joy of teaching in class is I don't have to go to these places. So they can come back and they can report. I mean, the really interesting ones were these cultural ones. The Hellenic Museum did all sorts of interesting things about Islam. I could tell you about it, but I won't.
Yeah. All right. I think Alice, Lee, and then Hubie.
Okay.
Alice,
My impression of Jewish museums, like the one in Milwaukee, is that their emphasis is more on history than religion.
I've not been to that one since, well, actually, since I was a child, I think. So
I haven't been that.
yeah.
Somebody asked about Spertus before. I mean, you know, that building has taken on different, you know, they redid it. It's beautiful. It's a venue to, you know, go get married or, you know, have an event. And they also have a college and have a lot of outreach, and they need classrooms and that type of thing. And I think the museum is still there. It's just very small. Lee and then Hubie.
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of opening Pandora's box here, but not being a museum studies expert, my assumption is there are curators that put together exhibits. So I'm envisioning a museum wanting to do an exhibit. Oh, that's my watch. I'm envisioning a museum wanting to do an exhibit on Israeli history. Who chooses whether it is presented or curated in a pro-Palestinian voice or in a
Lee,
voice?
if it's Israeli, it's going to be Israelis doing it. If you want to go to a Palestinian museum and they say Palestinian, I think it's very clear cut by just the language.
But what if it's the Art Institute, or what if it's a museum that isn't not a religious based museum? The choice of curator, is that up to the board of directors? I mean, who decides what voice a certain curated exhibit is going to have?
Right. Jim said museums are very intentional in their design.
Yeah, they're very, very professional, very intentional. And there's codes of museum ethics, which supposedly guide the decisions made by curators. Typically, it is considered unethical and inappropriate for the board or for donors to be interrupting the curatorial role, but it clearly happens. So I can tell you what the official answer is, that is a professional curator working within the bounds of curatorial ethics will make those decisions. In actuality, like everywhere else, pay attention to the news. Look at University of Pennsylvania. I mean, it's or Harvard. I mean, money talks.
Yeah. All right. We have Hubie, Rick, and then Jeff.
Okay.
Hubie.
One of the problems I think you have in teaching your class is different museums have different goals.
Yes.
And they're oriented totally differently. And now I had in my work career, I had the opportunity to work with the Museum of Science and Industry. And I can tell you, you talk about these curators, not only that, they have a staff and they have terrific internal fights as to what they're going to show. And the other problem you have, which you point out, is because they come very deep into us. And yes, there is tons of information, but they have a fight as to how much information they're going to show, and people feel that they're not showing enough, and they have terrific discussions internally, which we never see.
Yeah. And so in addition to the code of ethics is also the best practices. So for interpretation, for example, it's typically you can't put more than 50 words on a placard. For before people stop reading. So we had a curator come talk to my class to talk about the research she did, and then you spend 6 months doing research and it becomes 50 words on a 1-inch by 4-inch plastic placard. So that is you're absolutely, and there was a huge fight over even getting that placard.
Right.
I'm sure. Rick,
Let me unmute.
I unmuted you.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome.
Taking on Lee's question about who decides and what is actually said and who decides what is shown. It's my understanding there's a very recent federal law that has gotten involved in that very issue, and that there are, for instance, with exhibits of Native Americans, they now have to go to the tribes to get permission as to what they show and their agreement as to how the objects are explained. So they're interceding in this whole curatorial role.
That's correct. That's NAGPRA, for those who want to look it up. So that's the Native American Graves and I have the Native American Graves, Patrimony, and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, which has to do with objects of central cultural relevance, grave items, human remains, and things like that. Not anything which is Native American falls under its legal coverage. However, most museums have taken anything which is Native American and applied NAGPRA to it, even if it doesn't actually is not an actual human remain or was taken from a gravesite. So yes, there's an entire sort of set of practices. What do you do with that? And someone who mentioned, I think a little earlier on, repatriation. Repatriation is the return of objects to Native American tribes, which might choose to destroy an object, to rebury an object, or to make the object inaccessible to researchers or the public. And under NAGPRA, they have the right to do that. Whether that is the right thing to do or not is a discussion one can have. Probably not in 5 minutes, but
No.
it's and again, this is Native American objects are a special case, legally speaking, in North America. NAGPRA does not cover, for example, objects from indigenous Mexicans, Polynesians, Africans, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm going back to the Oriental Institute. We haven't been there in years, but
Change this, by the way, something else now.
I was sort of struck by the fact that I realized that Israel wasn't one of the great powers, but you'd see Egypt and the collection probably was done in the early 20th century, I assume. But there was Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Sumerian, nothing, as far as I recall, relate to Israel or Jewish artifacts.
That's one a student went to for me. I've not been to in a long time, but my recollection is you're correct. And this is a guess. My guess is that's because Jewish studies was a different department at the University of Chicago as opposed to Oriental studies. So it wouldn't have even occurred to them to bring in Jewish material because that was simply outside of their zone of expertise. But that's a good example of sort of a research museum. There is stuff on display. Typically, it's best practices to display 5 to 10% of your materials for the public, but I think for them it's more like 1% of their stuff is for you to look at. The rest is all sitting in storage, the tablets and things and objects. So we have only a few minutes left. There's one final comment from, looks like
Elaine, I'm gonna, there.
Then if I can have a minute or two at the end, but go ahead.
Yes, please.
There is a lot of Judaica around in small towns in the US and in Canada. We were at a bar mitzvah in Appleton, Wisconsin, and there was a violin from 1800s in display there. But we were also on a tour in Canada, and in the town of St. John's, Canada, is a big poster advertising the Jewish Historical Museum. We didn't have a chance to get to it, but it was being advertised, and we don't know how many Jewish people are there, but it was interesting to find out these little towns do have Jewish artifacts.
Yeah, they do indeed. Marker, Sandy, last one.
Thank you for that. We're going to be in St. John's in about 5 months.
Oh.
We'll let you know, Vanessa.
Okay. I think I need to go there and check it out, though. And then Jeff Rivlin said, is there a difference between a traveling collection versus permanent collections in terms of ethics?
Mm.
Yeah, there are, but because I'm not a museum professional, I can't tell you exactly what they are. I can't, if you're interested, you can actually, the national, whatever the name of their association is, that the standards are up online. You can, if you Google it, you can find the standards for that they're supposed to follow. Including some proposed ones, which haven't been adopted yet. So just to try to sum up, I asked my students in this class to think of sort of best practices, and then actually we put on an exhibit ourselves at Lake Forest College, a little pop-up exhibit. We did a sort of a one-day exhibit on the history of religion at Lake Forest College, and then the present-day practice of religiosity and spirituality among our students. It's interesting asking 18 to 22-year-olds to sort of try to sum up sort of what their experience was with studying museums. But I was really impressed by the way in which they found often sort of these implicit assumptions, and I was really struck by the way in which one of the things they noted was a very sort of Protestant set of assumptions about how belief is central and how belief in doctrine and text was emphasized, and when it was made explicit when it was there, but things like practices and things like everyday and things like religion of the house as opposed to the temple or the church or the synagogue or the mosque was often occluded. It was missing. But you think about sort of the everyday Judaism, for example, use that as an example. Now, part of that is if you want to put a Torah scroll on display, that's pretty easy. You buy one somewhere. Or you don't steal it, I hope, but you buy it and you put it up there. To put a challah on display. I mean, you could lacquer one, I suppose. But I mean, if you think about sort of like the everyday practice of Judaism, what can you actually access? What do we want to look at, right? And then, but how does that portray what Judaism is? Is Judaism about text and Torah? Well, obviously, yes. I'm a bunch of Jews, we can say yes. But is Judaism also about, the challah Friday nights? I mean, yes, as well. But how would you display that? Actually, if you go to the old streets of Old Milwaukee at the Old Milwaukee Museum, which I think they've taken down, they did have actually a European Jewish family having Shabbat dinner sort of on display, but again, it was a lacquered challah. But the centrality of belief in doctrine and in text over sort of everyday practice, which is why my students chose for our exhibit actually to use oral history. So we actually talked to students about what they did and what their practices were, and then we used technology where you could click a QR code and it would they would talk to you about what they did. And we heard a lot more about practice and about sort of identity than we did about sort of beliefs and doctrines and dogmas. This is somewhat akin, again, Vanessa and I were talking during the breakout rooms about if you go to the Holocaust Museum here in Illinois and in Chicago to that little the holograph display, and you get to hear sort of from survivors about what they're, who they are, as opposed to just sort of the stories which typically are told. I see we're over time. I could keep going, but thank you so much.
You could indeed.
Thank you.
I just want to say that next week is David Zarefsky, and he has a very specific, he's talking about LBJ. You'll see it in your Macomb at home, hopefully with the correct link. And we're really, everyone here, we also talked about how many museums has everyone on this Zoom been to? Probably 1,000, but next time we go, we're going to have different eyes on it. So
really,
good to see everyone.
As much as I do. So go and enjoy and think.
Ben, I wanted to say one more thing to you. When you mentioned the museum in Milwaukee, you don't necessarily call it a religious object, but I remember when I went there, what struck me the most when I'd go from room to room, the only home that had a bookshelf was the Jewish home. And that says as much about Judaism as a picture of a rabbi on the wall.
Yeah, I think they took all that down because I think the Milwaukee Museum moved, and I think that Streets of Old Milwaukee and the European streets, whatever they called that, I don't know if they're going to put it back up. But I hadn't picked up on that was the only room with the books, but I'm not surprised to hear it. So thank you all.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.